Hello and welcome to A Closer Look. We are a podcast held in a Discord server, and it's just a community of people. We all really enjoy history, and we just chit-chat a little bit about history, and at least once a week, maybe sometimes more, we'll jump into voice chat here and have somewhat of a formal podcast where we'll actually hit the record button and we'll upload this thing to up to YouTube. So if you want to join the next conversation, take a look at the description down there. You'll see a link. If you click on that, it should bring you right into the server here. The Discord server itself is set up into different time frames. So any form of history at all that you want to talk about, you can come on in here. You'll find somebody to chat with. So I hope you'll make your way in here. That being said, on our previous podcast, we had talked about a guy. His name was Alcibiades. There's a couple different ways. It's kind of there's kind of a debate there, I think, to how to pronounce his name, but I think we're pronouncing it Alcibiades. And Krauko, he's one of our admins here in the server. He went into pretty good detail about this guy and kind of gave us his lifetime story, and it was very fascinating. So I highly encourage, if you haven't heard that yet, to go back and find our first podcast we put up. It's going to tie into what we're going to talk about today, which is the Peloponnesian War. And so Krauko is going to take this off. I'm going to pass the torch to him, and he's going to run with it. Krauko, how you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm good. I'm excited to hear about this. We've been talking about this a little over, the past few days, and I've done a little research myself. And man, it's this is just an interesting time frame to look at, considering it's so much different than the era that we live in. It's just kind of like fantasy land in your imagination.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's definitely fascinating, especially to look at the Peloponnesian War and see how this all kind of started, the kind of warfare that we know today. I mean, there's a lot of links you can put between what happened in the Peloponnesian War and what kind of effects that had in later warfare, and especially World War I and World War II were very comparable to it, and Cold War II. But I'll get to all that in a bit. I'll first kind of lay out for you guys where we are in the time frame. This happens in roughly 430 to 404 BC. So that's about 50 years after the very famous Battle of Thermopylae, which is what we see in the modern movie called 300. I'm pretty sure everybody knows about that one. And it also happens a fascinating 800 years after the sack of Troy. So before I actually start explaining about this war, it's important to note that the historian who actually recorded most of this information was an historian that I'm sure will be very familiar to any of the professional historians out there, Thucydides. He was kind of the father of scientific history and political realism. Now, what scientific history kind of dives into is eliminating this aspect of there being a deity that influences a war that normally, before Thucydides really came around, historians would always include Zeus was responsible for this decision, or Hermes was responsible for this decision. And what he really did was kind of keep it evidence-based and not include the gods as much, which is why his records on this wars are so incredibly accurate. He's also the father of political realism, which kind of revolutionized the way we look at politics and history by looking at the emotions of the individuals who are ruling rather than looking at it like this giant chess game. What he was also known for was his kind of nihilistic view on human nature. So what was often said is that people are born with the shackles of primality, and that the concept of civilization and security kind of frees them from that, allows them to grow. But Thucydides kind of took a opposite position to that and said that civilizations are actually kind of the shackles that keep you away from those primal urges to skirmish and murder and rape and all that. And that's why this war was especially fascinating to him, because the Peloponnesian War kind of brought that out of humans for the first time in a very, very long time. Well, I'll explain about that, how it goes later. But first, it was a question from Logos.
Yeah, one of the main things I've seen that's been lacking in a lot of descriptions on this war has been a really good detailed description of why it started in the first place. I mean, there's a little here and there about, there was foreign trade, that there was getting cut off, and some basic strategic, elements. And a lot of it actually looked preemptive, that a lot of people were worried that, their trade routes might get cut off and different things. But I haven't really heard a very just, simplified, easy to understand description.
All right, so I can kind of boil this down to, and if you really, really boil this down to why the war started, it's that Athens was growing in power exponentially. They were becoming a massive force. So other nations like Sparta wanted to keep that in check and make sure they wouldn't grow beyond that, because, they didn't know if 50 years from then they might be so powerful that they even make Persia look like a infantile little nation compared to them, which it really did seem like it was going that route. But if you want to go more into the complexity of how this war started, it really founds itself into a lot of rebellions in allied city-states and the paranoia of the leaders and both of these great nations, and a lot of political feuds which were often grounded in, as to what you said, the whole trade routes being cut off and all that. So it's really hard to explain why the war did start. But as I said, if you boil it down real bad, it's just Athenian was growing and the Spartans didn't like that. So yeah. Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I think so. If we were going to kind of just chop that down a bit, I think, it sounds to me like it was a fear that if they got too big, they would eventually become their own oppressors.
Definitely.
And especially in that time frame, I mean, slavery was probably very common. And tyranny was probably also very, very common. So
very much so, yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure that always lingered in their minds. So again, it was probably that very fear and paranoia that really started it.
Yeah, and it also kind of roots itself into this, like you said, the paranoia, especially in Sparta, that really fueled this need for a war. Anyways, I'll go back to explaining about this war, and it kind of took place in 3 stages. You have the Archimedean War, you have the Peace of Nicaeus, and then you have the Second Archimedean War. So, I mean, first the war started off with the Archimedean War, which was basically just a whole lot of skirmishes around the city-states that aligned themselves with Athens, and especially the smaller villages that surrounded Athens. Athenians didn't really suffer much from this Spartan influence. Oh wait, I should first say there were 2 sides in this war. So you have on one side the Delian League from the Athens, which had a very strong navy, and the Peloponnesian League, which was Sparta with its strong infantry. So to go back to Athens, so the Spartans did a whole lot of skirmishes around Athens. A lot of villages suffered from that. But the Athenians didn't really suffer much because they still had access to sea and at the time, scorched earth methods, they weren't really advanced. I mean, if you can try this out for yourself. If you go and try to burn wheat or grains, it's very difficult. So trying to burn a whole field or salt a whole field, it really wasn't as um, something they could really do very well unless they stayed for a very long time, which really they suffered from in monetary gains. So that wasn't really worth it. And initially, the Spartans were thinking about going for the Athenian capital head on until a small little twist from nature came in, which was that the Athenians suffered from a plague, and this plague killed off a fourth of his population. Now, if you want to compare that to modern day, say that a fourth of the population of America is killed like that. You're talking about 70 million dead, or maybe 100 million. That's a very big number. And such a sudden and very fast collapse of their population really scared the Spartans off, actually. So they called their battle off because the Spartans really just didn't want to risk getting infected themselves or bringing that disease back to Sparta. So instead, the Spartans rely on attacking the allies of Athens and then pulling back to their own country. After which the peace of Nicaeus comes in. Now, if you've listened to my last podcast, you probably think that the name Nicaeus comes very familiar to you because Nicaeus is not only one of the generals that found himself in the Sicilian expedition, but he's also the foremost statesman when it came to saying that peace should be kept around in Athens. So the peace of Nicaeus was a peace that the Athenians brokered with the Spartans in order to keep themselves alive after this horrible plague that brought through them, and this lasted for 6 years. So if anyone has any comments they want to get on the aspects of the Archimedean War before I go on to the next part.
Kind of conspiring here, I guess. It's just sort of a conspiracy theory. I had saw because we talked about, kind of tying this into more modern events. And I had saw a video one time that talked about the actual roots of, America. And it talked about kind of sort of how we came into the United States. And the people in this video had asserted that we had actually spread some diseases around in America here to kill off some of the Indian tribes that were here.
Oh yeah. That definitely happened. I don't think it was intentionally, but when you introduce a population that's immunized itself to the Black Plague, it doesn't mean that they don't carry that on them. So of course, when the settlers came around in America, a lot of people died simply because they were exposed to diseases they never been exposed before to. And if you look at the Archimedean War, I don't think they really had the knowledge on biology and medicine to really know what spread diseases in the first place. So I don't think that really was the case, though there definitely is a case where biological warfare is used, and that's with the Attila the Hun, if you ever knew about that.
No, I'm not familiar.
All right. So what Attila the Hun actually did when he couldn't capture a castle because its defenses were too bad and too strong, he'd take a catapult and he'd put in the catapult, instead of rock or flaming objects or anything like that, he put corpses of Black Plague victims into it, and he shoot them over the wall and have them land to the castle, and he just wait outside the castle for a month or two and then you could go in because everybody would be dead. So that was the first historical use of biological warfare for you.
Wow, that is that's pretty crazy. Now, I guess let me ask this question though. Going back to this topic, do we know how the plague started? I mean, was there ever anything there that accredited it, or could it have been from maybe foreign travelers?
There's very little info about how it actually started. They aren't even sure what disease actually killed them all. There's no information about how it spreaded. Nobody knew it, and that's mostly because the historians at the time, they didn't have really the knowledge on biology and medicine to really comprehend what could possibly cause something like that. But it definitely did. It did happen. That was for sure. But
now in their mind, in this time frame, though, they really would have been saying that this was a sign from the gods. Is that going to sound about right?
Yeah, that does sound like something they would probably do. And I believe a lot of statesmen actually did accredit it to that as a sort of painful blessing, because it did ward off the Spartans. Anyway, should I continue now? Or do you want to anyone here have anything else to say? Or
yeah, if you guys that are in here with us, if you have any questions, by all means, feel free to ask.
Yeah.
If not,
okay, I've got one I'd like to ask.
Yeah.
As far as a reference to time frame, I know you're speaking of the Peloponnesian Wars as far as the Athenians and the Spartans against each other, as compared to when the Athenians and the Spartans came together as for, say, at the pass in Thermopylae to take on the Persians. Was this before or after that point in time?
I elaborated on a little bit earlier at the time. So this happened 50 years after the Battle of Thermopylae. And
so they had basically fought off the Persians, and now they decided to go back to fighting each other.
Yeah. And a very funny fact about that is actually that 50 years later, the Spartans actually allied themselves with the Persians.
Well, yeah, because they had a long history of fighting before they ever came together to fight the Persians.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yes, sir. Okay, good enough. Thank you.
All right. I think that's all the questions. So continue with the story. So I was talking about the Peace of Nicaeas. Anybody who's familiar with the last podcast I held, we were talking about the Sicilian expedition, which was initiated by Alcibiades. So I won't really elaborate on that further. If you wanna know about the Sicilian expedition, you feel free to go to our last podcast. I talk about a lot more detail there. So after the Sicilian expedition ends, which is a senseless reignition of the war between the Delian League and the Peloponnesian League, which is Athens versus Sparta. Once this war really reignites, the Athens suffered a major defeat, which leads the Spartans to taking advantage of that and starting a second Archimedean war against Athens. And the Athens really lose this war, and that's mostly to a credit to the Spartans. As I said earlier, they start to ally themselves to Persians, and the Persians had a lot of money. So they used that money to confront a problem that they've been having since the beginning, and that's that the Spartans are very good at fighting on land, and the Athenians are very good at fighting on sea. So they never meet each other because they keep to their own territory. So when the Spartans would find a Athenian fleet, they would flee away in terror, and when the Athenian infantry would see Spartans, they would flee away in terror. So once the Persians started to fund the Spartan Spartan war effort, they got a lot of money, which allowed them to do a very peculiar thing, and I think a very ironic thing. When you look at the Battle of Thermopylae, which is that the Spartans started to build giant fleets and attempt to take out their enemy with sheer numbers, which is exactly the opposite of what happened in the Battle of Thermopylae. This tactic did prove useful. So eventually, Athenians, they lost the war. They surrendered to the Spartans, and a lot of allies to the Spartans demanded that all the Athenians be killed and that the women and children be enslaved, which is kind of the norm for wars at that time. But the Spartans actually refused because of their warrior ethics. They actually respected the Athenians for fighting so well, and through that respect, they decided not to do that. So that's where I end the little summary of the Peloponnesian summary. After this, I'm going to go into the concept. Before I do that, I want to see if anybody has any questions about it.
What exactly do you think gave them the capabilities that they had? I mean, what made them superior on the sea, the Athenians?
Oh, that's definitely their ability to navigate their ships. They had captains that were a lot better at navigating their ships in a way that it gave them a tactical advantage on sea. And what you need to know about naval warfare at the time is that it mostly involved triremes. Now, what's important to know about triremes is that the name literally implies water spears. They're very hard to use. There was a modern day attempt at recreating a trireme using modern day technology and athletes, and even in that case, they barely were able to move it without having the whole thing fall over on itself, because it's such a complicated thing to use, which is very fantastic that especially during the Sicilian expedition, they managed to have 200 of these things go and launch this expedition of that lasted weeks, even though these ships were kind of meant to travel a single day, and then everyone would be too exhausted to go on. And these ships are kind of like built as these three rows. So you'd have three levels of people rowing, and the ships were kind of built like darts, as thus the name water spears, because the whole reason that they were built like that is so they could ram into other ships and destroy them. Now, you'd have like three rows of people rowing these giant ships and bringing them to a maximum of 8 knots, which is 15 kilometers or 9 miles per hour. So that was a real fantastic use, and the Athenians mastered the art of using these triremes, which is why they were so capable at fighting at sea. And when you look at the Spartans, they instead had a incredible infantry, which existed out of hoplites, which were citizen soldiers, which is important to know they were citizen soldiers, because if you were a citizen during the Greek era, that kind of meant you were, let's say, in the middle class, sort of. So you had a lot of money comparably to the peasantry, which allows you to buy the whole equipment that a hoplite would have. And how a hoplite would be equipped, rather than what you might see in the 300 movie. I'll probably get into that on a later podcast with more detail, but it's very important to know they didn't go out like almost stark naked with only a mantle and a spear and shield. In fact, they went in full bronze heavy equipment. I mean, they covered everything. They had a helmet, they had their torso, their their vanguards, their shin guards, everything was covered by bronze. And then that leads you to like a massive weight of 43 kilograms or 95 pounds. And even the Spartans had it much heavier because they made their entire shields out of bronze too, which probably like led it up to like, I don't know, 50, 60 kilograms. So that's very fascinating how that worked. The triremes being so hard to use and hoplites being so heavily equipped and well trained.
Compare that to today's soldiers that are just carrying, maybe at most plate carriers, if they even have plates. I don't think our soldiers even have plates in their carriers. They just wear a chest rig, but then all their gear and stuff. But just compare that, and then given the limited resources that they had and the clothing, the shoes and stuff. I mean, man. I mean, they had to be a real manly man to carry all that.
Yeah, you do. And especially considering at the time they didn't have their Humvees to drive them everywhere. They had to march.
Yeah, and for a long time and period. On those trips like that, where did they get their food and water? I mean, did they carry all that with them or what?
They had the slaves to carry them. Yeah. And that's the funny thing. I'll go into that in a lot more detail later on. But you'd think with that much equipment, you want to ride on a horse, right? But the funny thing is, the Greeks never really explored the idea of cavalry until the Peloponnesian War. So that's a very interesting thing to think about, especially when you consider that the equipment that these hoplites had was kind of equal almost to the weight that a knight from the medieval ages would wear.
That's surprising that up until that point, they never considered to just jump on the back of a horse and ride it instead of walking. I would think that'd be the first thing you'd think of.
Yeah, I'll explain later as to why they didn't do that and why they started doing that during the Peloponnesian War. So I'll get into a lot more detail about that later as to the whys and hows. But for now, I think it's good to carry on. I don't think anybody else has any questions. I'm not hearing anybody, so I'll go on. So I'm gonna introduce here 3 concepts of war before the Peloponnesian War came about. So there really were 3 ways that you would commit to a war, and someone would be called a civilized war with large quotation marks. The first would be skirmishes. These short skirmishes. They plunder and raze a small village, and then the opposing nation would do the same to them, and that's kind of where it would end. And these were very rapid executions of warfare. It wasn't very advanced because they didn't have really any kind of scorched earth methods that we have right now. But they did find an alternative to that during the Peloponnesian War. I'll explain about that later. The second kind of civilized war they would have is battles. And these were battles that involve rules, like maybe no kicking or stopping when a third of the enemy is dead. Or it was really unusual how they did that. And after a battle, which these battles included like 2 infantry hoplite legions coming together, facing one each other outside of city walls. The leaders would come together and shake hands sometimes, even before and after the battle. And after the battle had ended, they'd exchange that and they go their own merry ways, and that would be it. Which even was what kind of the case was, not quite so, but kind of the case during the Battle of Thermopylae. And what happened during the Peloponnesian War is that all these rules were kind of wavered away. They didn't care about it anymore because of this paranoia that the Spartans and the Athenians had for each other. So there was no civility. Either one army died or the other died. And there were no retreats. There was no exchange of dead. If two armies faced each other, either one of the parties would be completely wiped out by the end of it. And a third kind of civilized war were sieges. Now, sieges during the time were incredibly ineffective. Like, nobody would even try to do something like that unless they were very mad or very convinced that they could win. And that's because walls were virtually unassailable. Now, why is that, you might think? And that is because there were kind of 3 or 4 different ways you can go about taking out a city that has walls. So, first option is building very simple ladders to get over the walls. But the problem there was they couldn't throw cooking water or simply push the ladders away. So that was very effective. So they looked to using a battering ram. And the alternative to that was making a second reinforcement inside the wall. And then even when the battering ram came through and all the soldiers go and try and charge in, there would be a second gate, and they would kind of be funneled in and killed very quickly by just bow and arrow. So that one was very effective. So when they looked at a wall and they were thinking, oh, well, we can't go over them, we can't go through them, and we might as well try to go under them. The problem there was that, well, the Greeks weren't very good at siege engines. They were amazing pyrotechnics. So when they try to kind of dig under these walls, which is very hard because they had a lot of rock in the earth, so it would take a very long time to actually do that. The cities would kind of use these kind of, like, not really smoke bombs, but more like very large fires they'd start, and once the wind was right, it would blow right into those tunnels that they'd make to go under it, and everybody was trying to dig would just be suffocated and die. So that was not very effective either. And what came about during the Peloponnesian War was this very smart idea of, if we can't besiege you, we'll force you to besiege us. Now, how they do that is they start the attacker to start building a wall around their wall. What do you do about that? There's nothing you can do about that. So it was hard to besiege a city with just people, because they didn't have enormous armies. Their armies would only exist to tops to 4,000 or 5,000 people. They couldn't surround an entire city with that number. So they just build these walls around them, and the cities just kind of starved to death. And that's how a lot of sieges went in the Peloponnesian War, and it caused a lot of death, and a lot of death by starvation especially. So that's the 3 concepts of so-called civilized war. Does anybody have anything to add to that?
A couple things, I guess. First, let me ask this question on the wall. What did they build these walls out of?
They generally build it out of stone and wood. That'd be mainly it. It would be very simple walls. They wouldn't really spend a lot of money on it, of course, because these were very grave undertakings. So oftentimes they go through the surrounding villages of a city, and they'd collect all the people they could find, all the men, all the women, all the children, and they'd enslave them all to do this work of building all these walls. And they often even use the stones that they originally used to build their houses to build these walls.
A pretty horrific time there. I mean, you imagine being the receiving end, living in these small villages with your family, and one day you're, just worried about feeding your family and enjoying your family, and the next thing you know, the next day you're building a wall in a war. I mean, that's got to be pretty tragic.
Definitely. Mm-hmm. And it goes even far worse than that during the Peloponnesian War. I mean, there are some people who suffer a lot worse fate afterwards. But I'll cover that later. So, during the Peloponnesian War, there were three concepts that kind of evolved to counter these three problems that they had. So the first was cavalry, which I mentioned earlier. Beforehand, horses weren't really used in Greece. Nobody used them. Even the peasants were very, very. They'd maybe have one for plowing. Even then, they didn't really have the technology to plow using a horse. So they were generally considered useless. And the only two uses they did have was for the rich and mighty to prance around about on these horses and have a lot more of a influential look when they go through towns. And the other one use was for scouting. So soldiers would take these horses to have the extra mobility that they needed to scout out enemy areas. But that was really about it. There were no other uses for it. Greece really considered them useless, but they also were romanticized a lot. I mean, take a look at mythos today. I'm sure you can find some examples. I mean, look at Pegasus, centaurs. I don't know if anybody else here has any examples of how they romanticize horses, but in general, they were considered noble and valuable creatures, even if they were useless, that were kind of left alone and kept out of war. And one peculiar thing that happened during the Peloponnesian War was that it was no longer a war that was fought between the Hoplites and between navies. This was being done a lot between peasants and slaves who were being enlisted as soldiers as well. And these peasants, they didn't have the money to buy fancy armor and fancy weapons. All they had was maybe a spear, and if they were very lucky, even a helmet and a shield. That was all they had. So they would be sent out to perform these skirmishes, and what proved really useful during a skirmish, whether you'd be the victim to one or the aggressor to one, was being very fast. So that's what these horses were eventually used to. They could use a horse to run down people who were running away from them. And on a horse, you're a lot faster. And when you're the victim, you can run away from hoplites a lot faster when you're on the back of a horse. But a third use was kind of being discovered here when hoplites and cavalry would clash, and the cavalry would be surprisingly effective at taking them down. I mean, these peasants were killing hoplites even though they had a lot better armor and a lot better equipment, and that was purely due to the fact that they could just run them over with a horse or charge them at a lot higher speed. So the Spartans were kind of playing around with the idea of using cavalry, but they didn't really use it until after the Peloponnesian War. And you can bet after the Peloponnesian War, cavalry was being used almost everywhere. You have any thoughts about that?
It's just a new concept to me to think that anyone ever held any reservations, because now, we look back medieval times and stuff like that. It just seems like it's, always been a very strategic advantage in war to have, even from an aerial perspective, you got to look at it from just being on the back of a horse. You're fighting with a vertical advantage. You're fighting down to your enemy, and they're having to fight up. I mean, if you're on the ground trying to fight an enemy that's on a horse and they're really up higher, I mean, it's really difficult. You would think to try to, take them out.
It's fancy to see how culture kind of played into this, because the Greeks really did romanticize the horses into not using them. That was really kind of counterproductive to their warfare.
Yeah, that is fascinating. That is very fascinating. I don't suppose that would be intentional. I guess that was just a sort of a mistake, a big oof.
Yeah, kind of like just a mistake of their culture, I suppose. And it's not very surprising to think about. I mean, when you think about horses in the setting of a farm, I mean, how much use do they have in a farm? And especially when you don't have the technology to make horses plow your fields, they're practically useless to you. So why keep them?
Yeah, aside from transportation and stuff, yeah, they would basically just be something else to worry about feeding.
Right.
But talking about a farm, I know not everybody, especially in today's society, is in an environment where you may see horses a good bit. I do, and I will tell you this: if you've never really been around horses and stuff much, you've never actually been to one, you'd be surprised how many people have never actually stood next to a horse. They are exceptionally, they're large. I mean, they're intimidating. They're very intimidating creature. They're massive in comparison to a human.
It's very important to note here, and it's kind of comical. The only kind of horses that were around in Greece were Shetland ponies. So they were a lot less intimidating.
Well, I guess they could have been. They could have rode up on a donkey. That would have been a little worse.
I mean, even on a donkey, you're higher, so that's an advantage, nonetheless.
Well, perhaps that was the example the Spartans saw, and they said, "No, we're not having anything to do with that."
Yeah, probably. All right. Is there anybody else who has input before I move on to probably the darkest chapter in the Peloponnesian War? No, I don't see anybody, so I'll move on. So, a very interesting and more so very gruesome aspect that was introduced in the Peloponnesian War was a little thing that we're very familiar with today called mass murder. This was really capitalized on during the Peloponnesian War, which was somewhat of a war of terror. You see, this is rooted in, during the Peloponnesian War, it was a lot of swaying of allies and opponents their allies, because these weren't large countries. They were alliances of one city-state with a whole bunch of other city-states. That's why they were called the Delian League and the Peloponnesian League. So what they tried to do was kind of scare the allies of the opponents into changing sides. And how they did that was through a whole load of reasons and ways. They performed skirmishes almost daily. They even had state-sponsored terror, which were laws that indicted these grueling and really barbaric punishments that, for their standards at the day, were even grueling. And this was about a long time ago when slaves were okay. So when you're talking about those essences, then if something's is considered grueling, then it really is a little level above. So what the Athenians did, they said, any Spartan we find, any sailor from Sparta we find, anybody who's allied to Sparta, if we find you, we cut off your right arm or your right thumb so you can never work again. So that was their punishment. And that was a big punishment. If you were living at the time, if you didn't have your right hand, you were useless. You were gonna die of hunger. Because there were no social policies to keep you on your feet. Nobody cared about you back then. If you can work, if you can do anything, then you'd either beg on the streets or you die. And there was a very slow and painful death that was inflicted on any Spartan they found, or any ally to Sparta they found. And the Spartans counteracted this with a law of their own. So they said, any Athenian soldier, a sailor we find, if we find even one Athenian sailor on your ship, doesn't matter if everybody else is a Spartan or not, every single person on that ship is getting overthrown, overboard, they're all going to be drowned. Every single one. No matter what your profession is, you get killed because you affiliated yourself with an Athenian. So these were really heavy and weighty laws that really scared a lot of people to death. And that calls for a lot of sway in this war with a lot of city-states swaying one way or another in order to keep themselves alive, because they were scared shitless of everybody else around them. And they had no way to protect themselves. So it really created a big problem. And a very interesting event, or two very interesting events. One was that the Spartans had a problem with the Helots, because the Helots did something that you're very familiar with, probably, Logos, to the Cold War, which was they called for help to Sparta. Sparta said, oh, no, we're not going to get mixed up into this. And then they said, well, if you're not going to help us, then we're going to go to your enemies and ask them for help. Which is kind of what you see in the World War, in the Cold War, when you had, for example, Korea looking to America for help, and then saying like, if you're not going to help us, then we'll call for the Soviet Union to help us. That was kind of where this whole idea of proxy wars and all that really started. This was really the first instance of that kind of diplomatic tactic being executed, and executed well. And a lot of other city-states were thinking about executing that. So what the Spartans did was they came to the Helots. They protected them from the threat that opposed them. And a bit later, the Athenians came about. The Spartans told the Athenians to basically fuck off and not interfere. So the Athenians went away. They were very upset about that, but they didn't really do much else about it. And the Spartans still had a problem with the Helots. So they said, all right, this diplomatic thing that you pulled was very problematic. We want you to assemble 2,000 of your best men so we can fuel our army. So the Helots did that. They collected their 2,000 best men. They brought them all together and presented them to Sparta and said, these are our best men. They'll help you in the war effort. And the Spartans said, all right, thank you. And then they executed every single one of them. Every single one of those 2,000 men, they executed every single one of them. Purely to make clear that if any other state dared to put that tactic into motion, they do the same to them. If anybody has any comments before I go on to the next little dark event that happened in the whole war.
Well, that really puts a dent in the noble warriors of the 300 movie, don't it?
Mm-hmm. Definitely does. So, moving on to Athenians. The Athenians, shortly before the Sicilian expedition started, they had a shortage of men for their whole Sicilian expedition, so they looked to mercenaries. They hired mercenaries, but a group of mercenaries they came too late for the expedition. So the Athenians said, "All right, we don't have any use for you right here because the expedition already started. They're already way out there. We don't have any ships to carry you. Let's instead send you out to sea and kind of just skirmish some places around Sparta." And that's what they did. They sent the mercenaries out towards the Peloponnesian island, which was where Sparta was at. And the mercenaries came about on a city called Mycalosis. And they were unfortunate enough to not have any defenses because there was a war going on. All the soldiers were gone. And what the mercenaries did, they killed everyone. They went out and killed the men, they killed the children, they killed the wives, they killed every single living being in the city, and they burned everything. There was a very detailed description from Thucydides about how these mercenaries broke into a school and murdered and raped little children of like 7 and 8 and 9, and put everything to the stake and fire, and even went on to kill all the animals. Like nothing was alive after they went through there. Nothing. And you were talking about close to 100,000 overnight. If you compare that to maybe like World War II, that makes Hitler look like a little bitch, to be very honest with you, because that's the same as executing a sixth of a. Imagine doing that.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, when we go through and we study more modern history, we look at like the Bleiburg massacre, the Dachau massacre, and we look at Hitler, we look at Stalin, we think, oh man, this is horrific. But then you go back here and you look, I mean, these people have absolutely no regard for human life whatsoever, no matter the age, nothing. It is, I mean, just absolute savagery.
Mm-hmm. And in a way, the historian Thucydides was very pleased to be able to witness it, because he could kind of describe how the longer war progressed, the more this kind of unshackled primal human rage came up. And he made a very good note of this event, because it really showed how his theory was correct about humans being these terrible, vicious creatures that just destroyed and trampled and murdered and burned everything around them if they didn't have the shackles of society to keep them in check. And to a large part, he was proven right here. This was the ultimate proof of him being right about this, is his theory that prolonged war would bring about the worst of people. And I think you can go to World War One and World War II and see that happening very clearly, but it never quite happened like it did here. I think this is really, if we're talking about severity of war crimes, I think this very instant, this sacking of Mycalosis was the worst, the absolute worst ever. There's no getting above this. We're talking about an entire city killed and murdered and burned overnight with every single person, every single living being being killed quickly. And if you like, let's put this into percentages, right? We're talking about close to 100,000 people here. Put those percentages to modern day, and you're talking about millions, tens of millions, maybe even. That's like if Hitler did this whole Holocaust, then that really makes, when you look at modern warfare, like you said, you might think it's bad, but you don't realize until you look back at these events that you realize that it can get so much worse, and that you haven't even scratched the surface of how bad war can get.
Yeah, I mean, imagine what it would be like to drop a nuclear bomb on New York City. But the difference is that these people are not instantly vaporized. They have to one by one watch as their people around them are getting slayed and killed, knowing that it's coming their way, knowing that their next door neighbors, children were just murdered, and good God, man! I mean, imagine that being New York City. Again, you're in New York City, and you know that there are men that have totally infiltrated. They have completely taken over New York City. There's no escape out of this. My God, I mean, that's just horrific.
Exactly. It would indeed be like everybody in New York being executed overnight. That would be horrific. So that really puts into perspective for anybody who's looking at history, and especially at modern history, and thinks, oh wow, we're really going towards this really nihilistic and bad direction. You're wrong. You're absolutely wrong. If you think we're currently going in a bad direction, you're absolutely wrong, because look back at history and think to yourself how absolutely much worse it could have been. And if you look at today now, it looks like a sunshine compared to this, like an absolute walk in a park. But let's move on to the last answer in warfare. I think I already kind of covered this earlier, but it's to contrast the darkness of the last chapter. Let's go on to a very comical part, which was the wall wars. I really like to look back on this part of history and kind of see how ridiculous warfare could get. That they do this thing of building walls around a city in order to be successful.
Well, you could actually really tie that into the Berlin Wall and sort of the Cold War, and the wall that goes, that actually separated East and West Germany. That was essentially the concept there.
Yeah, I'd say that's exactly the same thing. It's just a modern interpretation of the wall warfare. And well, at the time, they didn't have planes to carry in their food, but I mean that's at the time they really didn't need to have siege towers or anything like that, which is exactly why I think the Battle of Troy was fake. Now, I'd like to go into that a little bit more. When you go back to the Battle of Troy, which in and of itself, there's a very, very little actual historical data about how that happened, except for the romanticized story. And romanticized story tells that they built this Trojan horse, right? This giant wooden horse on wheels, and they carried it over into the building, or into the city. Now, imagine for a moment, this was a giant wooden contraption on wheels. And this was 800 years before the Peloponnesian War started. So, what exactly would somebody think about that idea not being used to create siege towers 800 years before these kind of wall wars started? So that's really my point on Trojan, the sack of Troy being false, and that's because if they had the ingenuity and technical engineering to make a giant wooden horse be possible, then why wouldn't they just use that kind of technical ingenuity to make a siege tower and just go over the walls, rather than making this whole very prone to destructive means horse? Because what often would happen when you bring in a wooden statue, it's kind of like an effigy, so you burn it, right? I'm just saying this from like personal interpretation, but if I was the king of a city and I get this giant wooden effigy from my enemy out of respect, the first thing I would do is create a party and burn it at the midst, which would kill everybody inside. So that's a very risky strategy that they implied they would use there, which is exactly why I think it's false. It's a very risky strategy, and with the same technical ingenuity, they could have done something a lot safer and a lot more effective.
Yeah, and I don't understand. Yeah, I mean, and they could have just made catapults and launched dead bodies with the Black Plague on them across the wall.
That's the kind of technology that they didn't really discover until the I think about 200 years afterwards, after the Peloponnesian War.
Well, sure, but like you just said, though, I mean, if they had the wherewithal and the abilities to build that huge horse and put it on wheels, surely they would have had the wherewithal and the technology to make a basic catapult. I mean, that's really, really simple to do.
Exactly. I mean, it uses the same kind of idea as a uses, and you might think that a bow and arrow or sword were the first implementation of warfare weaponry, but it was the sling, which you might recognize from the whole story of David and Goliath, and how he used a sling to throw a stone at his head. That's the first kind of weapon that was really used during warfare. Even during the Battle of Thermopylae, there weren't all that many archers. There were a lot of slingers. So that definitely that idea of using a slinger, that was very basic to devising how you'd make a catapult. So especially if you have the technology to make a giant horse like that, then why wouldn't you have it to make a catapult or a siege tower? Which is exactly what you're saying. I absolutely agree with that.
That's interesting, Krauko. I think there might be a whole podcast just on that war there, because that's definitely a fascinating perspective.
I definitely love to go into the Battle of Thermopylae at some point, and maybe even later go into the Battle of Troy and kind of diffuse how that's not really how it could have happened, but I digress.
All right. Well, before we close out, does anybody have any final questions or comments?
I'm here, anybody.
Okay. Well, then in that case, thanks for listening in. We'll have some more podcasts coming up here in the future as well. I myself am preparing some content. It's going to take me a little bit to get it together. We may also do some book readings. I'm considering doing just some book readings in here, and then we can discuss, kind of what we've read. Not necessarily an entire book, but a few chapters out of some sort of intriguing books that might get you interested. And then we can discuss kind of the general idea of what the book's about and what's in it. So we may do some interesting things like that. So tune in for that and come on into the server. Like I said at the beginning, check the description in the video there. You'll see a link. Just click on that and bring it in. And if you're, in the Discord server and you're listening to this already, share this around. Let's get some more people in here and really make these podcasts more entertaining. The more people we get in here, the more conversation we get flowing, the more ideas we get, the more we can all learn and benefit from it. So with that being said, we will catch you guys later.